Buffers Virtual Field Day. To let you know, we are recording this virtual field day. So if you miss a portion that you want to go back and listen to again, we will share that link with you later on. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Amanda Gumbert. I am an Extension Water Quality Specialist here at the University of Kentucky. And so I get the honor of working with woodland owners, with farmers, with residents, with all kinds of folks who are interested in water issues. And so tonight we are focused on forested stream buffers, and you will find that I am a stream buffer enthusiast. I have lots of friends who are creek geeks and the like. And so anyway, we're just excited to bring this to you tonight. We're actually here during Water Week here in Lexington. And if you missed it, Tuesday was World Water Day, and we're in National Agriculture Week. So lots of things to celebrate related to water and agriculture. So you can see on your screen, you can hopefully you can see our agenda for the night. We'll move through that. We'll be kind of loose with some of that. But I want to remind you too that if you have questions as we go along, feel free to just drop those questions in the chat. By the time we get to you, you might have another question to go with it, or by the time we get to the Q&A, you might have forgotten your question. So if you've got one, just go ahead and drop it in the chat box and we will get to you. So what I would like us to do before we get too deep into our discussion is I would like for you all to do a little interactive activity with me. And so now hopefully you can see my screen that says, what do you think of when you hear the word buffer? And I'm going to drop a website link in the chat along with a access code. And so since you're already on your computer, you can also do this on your smartphone or your other device if you like. If you open up a web browser and you type in menti.com, www.menti.com, you should get a prompt to a place where you can answer the question, what do you think of when you hear the word buffer? And so I'd see some folks, if you can't get to that website, you can drop your answer in the chat as well. But if you can answer that question, then we can kind of watch a word cloud appear live and kind of see everybody's answers at once. So hopefully that is working, and let me know if you have trouble. We have at least one response so far. We've got water. And you can answer a couple, you can use, I think you have options for 2 different words that you can put in the word cloud. So this is kind of a fun interactive way to see what people think about when they hear the word buffer. So folks think about pH, that's probably a scientist or a chemist right there, thinking about pH and things that buffer pH and keep that balanced in the environment. A big one that's coming out is protection. So more than one person has answered protection. So as people respond to the question, you're seeing those words move around. And the bigger the word, the more times it has been entered as a response. So I think that's a fascinating way for us. I just want you to get your minds active, and I'll put the link back in. Thanks, Becca, for that prompt. It's menti.com, and the code is 16463780 should be your access. So we've got transition, protection, protective, a barrier, edge, trees, stabilizer, water, space. Somebody else dropped into the chat the border of a waterway. So I really do, I appreciate your comments and your response to this, and just kind of a fun way for us to interact and get our minds warmed up a little bit. So anyway, so another vote for protection. Thanks, Carol. That one is probably our most popular response. So at this point, I just wanted to kind of get folks thinking about it. And trees, yes, another vote for trees. Absolutely. I think about trees as well. So what we're going to do, we'll take just a couple more seconds if folks want to respond to that. And then we will move along with our agenda for the evening. Oh, there's another response. Transition barriers. Oh, a wall or edge in space. So really interesting responses that are coming in. So thank you all for entertaining me for just a second there as we think about the things that buffers can do for us. A change in original form. Oh, that's very creative. Awesome. Okay, so we'll take a break from our word cloud, just a fun little thing to do there. And so just wanted to remind you all that we are working together as a partnership. I've had the honor to work with Salt River Watershed Watch to create a series of videos, and we're still finishing those up, but that was the origination of this field day, was to work with Dr. Koontz and create some videos so that we could capture some important messages about buffers, as well as work that has been done in the Salt River Basin. And also just a note that this project has also been sponsored through an EPA grant, one through this Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, but then also under another project that is working with farmers. To bring farmers together to talk to one another about conservation and about ways that we can protect the entire Mississippi River Basin. So I'll advance my slides and start just a second here. I wanted to give a little quick introduction. I'd rarely give a presentation that I don't get to show this map, and that is all of those brightly colored watersheds that are there represented on the map, all combine together to form the Mississippi River Basin. And so all of that area drains to one common location, and that's the Gulf of Mexico. So 41% of the United States drains to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's pretty significant because we have a bit of an issue with too many nutrients getting to the Gulf of Mexico, causing a dead zone each year. And so the runoff that comes from farms, as well as cities, as well as every other land use that we have in the basin, contributes to this dead zone. And so this is just a brief map of what the 2021 area looked like. And we're talking a size of about 4 million acres. So a really significant land area, or a significant dead zone area. If we think about 4 million acres of land, that's a lot. So think about 4 million acres of water that are in this dead zone. And it's just an area that doesn't support aquatic life because the nutrient richness has created hypoxic conditions. So in Kentucky, it's like, okay, so we have this Mississippi River Basin, but what does that mean for Kentucky? And how are we related to that situation? And so in Kentucky, we also have smaller river basins, and we work to think about water quality issues really on that basin scale. And so the Kentucky Division of Water, who's our regulatory agency, has a basin team that coordinates a lot of the work that is done on the ground in Kentucky. And so they divide, of course, our state up into our major river basins, and then they work to identify priority watersheds. And tonight we're going to be focused in the Salt River Basin. And this is, so you can see us geographically located in Kentucky. And then those yellow areas of the map are our priority watersheds within the Salt River Basin. And if we zoom in a little closer, you'll see that Crooked Creek is one of those priority watersheds for Kentucky. And so that's where Dr. Koontz's property is, and we're going to learn more about that tonight. So quick overview of stream buffers. They're also called riparian zones or buffer zones. In forestry, of course, we call them streamside management zones when we have a harvest. And they're just that transition area of the water body, that the transition area of the from the water to an adjacent upland land use. And so I found this image earlier this week, and I just thought this was a really nice image of representing what our stream buffers can do for us. So we have trees right on the water's edge, shading the stream and also holding soil in place. Important that we have woody debris from those trees to help support the aquatic habitat as well. And ultimately, buffers give us lots of benefits in the ecosystem. They can filter stormwater runoff, uptaking excess nutrients. So when we think about the dead zone in the Gulf and we think about how all of the smaller watersheds influence the quality of the water in the Mississippi River and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico, we have to think about, what these functions are of the buffers. And so uptaking excess nutrients in the form of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium are really important. Of course, our buffers hold our stream banks in place. They help reduce flood damage, providing shade to streams and helping wildlife habitat. And then personally, I just think the aesthetic element is really important as well. So with that, I am going to transition over, and we want to get a glimpse of the farm that we're visiting during our virtual field day. So I'm going to switch over here to give us a bit of a preview and overview of Dr. Koontz and his property.
This farm was put together by my grandfather over 100 years ago. And it was a farm both for woods products and for livestock and corn produce. I have a lot of memories since age 4. My father was in the military and we traveled around, but this was home. And during the Second World War, I spent a lot of time out here as a kid.
The Kuhns family manages this wooded farmland located in Bullitt County in the Knobs physiographic region of Kentucky. This land is drained by Crooked Creek and is part of the Salt River Basin. A portion of the original farm was sold to create Knobs State Forest and Wildlife Management Area. The Kuhns family manages about 300 acres with a focus on soil conservation, water quality protection, and wildlife habitat enhancement.
Okay, the knobs are interesting geological formation. Their formation goes back to about 300 million years. 300 million years. They're composed mostly of shale. They have iron deposits with them, which made them attractive for the iron industry in early Kentucky's history. One early spring, we had 10 inches of rain in about 10 hours. These whole fields were flooded. We had to hike out over the Scout Dam here. The first time the spillway had ever flooded, and I had to hold on my dog to keep it from being swept away downstream. So it really reflects the runoff that can happen in this type of topography. And this is why it's important to keep the forest sustainable.
Riparian areas link water bodies and aquatic environments with upland land uses. Riparian areas are also called buffer zones or streamside management zones. Buffers are useful on all sizes of streams, creeks, and rivers, and even on lakes and ponds. Vegetation is typically composed of trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbaceous perennials. Stream buffers are important elements of watershed management and offer benefits such as protecting stream banks from erosion, holding soil in place, taking up nutrients in runoff water, and reducing flood damage.
I also joined the Salt River Watershed Watch, and that made me very sensitive to what was going on the farm. we also participated in the water quality form, sent the form in, and have since then been very sensitive to livestock interaction with the stream. We fenced those out of the stream, which I think contributed to the low coliform counts that we've had on the stream.
Kentucky landowners with 10 acres or more involved in farming or forestry must develop a Kentucky Agriculture Water Quality Plan to comply with state law. Developing a plan includes selecting best management practices that will be utilized on the farm to protect soil and water resources. Streamside buffer zones and restricting livestock access to streams are effective practices to include in ag water quality plans. These practices not only protect resources on the farm, but also help protect water quality downstream.
We've stopped growing crops per se, and in our fields to provide a more broad environment and ecosystem for wildlife, we've planted them with native grasses and in more recent years forbs. And I'm tremendously interested in trying to preserve the monarch butterfly, and we planted and have naturally a lot of milkweed, and that's dear to my heart. Our whole approach to these attempts is to prevent erosion and preserve the quality of the stream. And having trees grow along the side of the banks tends to stabilize them, preventing silt, which would then impair the natural biologic activities that take place within the stream, the effect on the macroinvertebrates, and the fauna that lives in the stream.
To learn more about utilizing riparian buffers to protect water quality, contact
All right, thank you, Dr. Koontz, for starring in our video. If I can get my video to come back on. There we go, I'm back. So at this point, I want to introduce Dr. Koontz. We've got him with us tonight. He's our farm host, although a virtual farm host. So thank you again, Dr. Koontz. Dr. Koontz is the steward of a farm in Woodland that's been in his family for 3 generations. He's always called Louisville, Kentucky, and Bullitt County home, but he's traveled widely with his own travels, but also with his family, as his dad served in the military. He graduated from Princeton and Duke Medical School, where he specialized in pathology, and then returned home to Louisville to practice and was the director of pathology department at Norton Hospital for 30 years. He's had a long-time interest in conservation and forestry through experiences on the family farm, the Boy Scouts, as well as non-formal educational opportunities that he's participated in with UK Department of Forestry Extension, the Kentucky Woodland Owners Association, Kentucky Watershed Watch, American Tree Farm Organization. My goodness, Dr. Koontz, you've been a stellar volunteer and landowner. The farm has received several stewardship and forest sustainability awards, but we are just delighted to have you here in person with us tonight. And so we're going to turn it over to you, and you tell us what we missed and what we need to know about your story and the farm story.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gumbert. One of the things that really got me interested in preserving the streams was my experience with the Salt River Watershed Watch. This is a wonderful organization in the Salt River Basin that trains volunteers to go out and monitor streams, and they look at a variety of items in the stream to test the health of that stream. And this ranges from measuring the dissolved oxygen, which is very necessary to support the macroinvertebrates and fish, to all the way to fecal contaminants, measuring the E. coli within the stream. And as I measured our streams, we had occasional high counts of coliform organisms. And we were not wondering, but knew where these were coming from. The cattle love to get in the stream, especially in the summertime, to cool off. So by fencing off the stream, as we showed in the pictures, this greatly reduced this organism within the stream. Other things that we began to pay attention to and was pointed out in the video is what was lining these branches and creeks that ran into Crooked Creek. And this we understood to be the forested riparian buffers. We at one point tried to enhance them and plant additional trees. That was not terribly successful, as we had heavy deer browse. We'll probably discuss this a little bit later.
Well, fantastic. Thanks for sharing that with us, Dr. Koontz. Anything else you would like to share about your experience with the farm?
Well, it's been a wonderful experience to try to understand the science behind these various activities, what each component of a riparian buffer provides. The tree are providing shade to the stream. Their roots entangle the soil. We really don't appreciate how the benefits of a root system with their little small tendrils. In addition, what else is in the buffer provides ecosystems for a variety of wildlife, including rabbits and squirrels. And then the next layer, the grassy layer, provides a habitat for pollinators. And these are necessary for the active and successful growth of crops. Also, turkey love the bugs. So these systems have an extensive use and offer so much to our environment.
Excellent. Well, thanks. Well, we're going to transition and watch a second video now about the maintenance challenges that you kind of touched on a little bit in your comments just a second ago. And then we'll discuss those a little bit more after this. But let's listen to some of the challenges that you had during the establishment and maintenance of the buffer.
This is what is called a passive buffer, and it has naturally occurred over the years. So I did not actively plan it as the more formal or constructed riparian buffers are done.
Riparian buffers can be established by actively planting trees, shrubs, grasses, and perennials. This method may be more labor-intensive, but may help prevent competition from existing vegetation or unwanted plants in the seed bank. Buffers can also be established by passive management, which is allowing vegetation to come back on its own. These are often referred to as no-mow zones. Both establishment methods require long-term management. An unmanaged riparian buffer can quickly be taken over by undesirable plants such as invasive species.
We're very interested in keeping it intact and enhancing it. And to that end, as you can see, we are being invaded by vine honeysuckle. And this is typically what it does. It comes out early in the spring and stays late in the fall. And it grows on any vertical surface. And you can see behind me some of these gums are being overwhelmed by it. It's growing on the ground, and we're very dismayed by what it's done to our buffering trees that have volunteered here.
Buffer zones often consist of 3 zones of planted native species. Zone 1 includes moisture-tolerant plants, often trees, that provide shading to the stream. This shading helps regulate water temperature and keep temperatures at optimal levels for aquatic life. Zone 2 often includes shrubs that are moisture tolerant but not necessarily wetland plants. Zone 3 includes grasses and herbaceous perennials that are tolerant of moderate to dry soil conditions. In urban settings, it may not be possible to create this delineation due to space and visibility constraints, but it is a good idea to include trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbaceous plants. This variety of plant types helps create a healthy stream buffer habitat.
We tried to put the prescribed layers, having trees at the riparian, at the edge of the stream, and then bushes, and then the grasses. We planted dogwood, we planted wild plum. What happened, we have very hungry deer, and they came along and nipped the tips of these, and the plantings died. So this is why we have the situation here where we have trees, we have volunteering trees and grasses intermingled, and then our grasses that we planted in the fields. My response would be to observe early in the invasive plant process and nip it in the bud. We've ignored this and didn't realize how far it had gone.
Common invasive species in Kentucky's riparian buffers include bush and Japanese honeysuckles, winter creeper, Callery or Bradford pear, and Japanese knotweed. Mechanical or herbicide treatments may be necessary to control invasive species once they become established. Landowners should also monitor newly planted buffers for wildlife browsing. In the long term, buffers should be inspected on an annual basis to ensure plant growth and survival, and to identify any areas of concern such as invasive species, storm damage, or signs of erosion.
Overall, these attempts improve the quality of the water.
To learn more about managing riparian buffers to protect water quality, contact your local cooperative.
All right, so just want to point out that some of those buffers that you saw, you would probably recognize, are not forested landscapes, and sometimes we have riparian buffers both in urban and in rural landscapes. So just to point that out and make sure we do recognize that buffers are important in all of our different landscapes. So I'm going to share just a few other comments. Dr. Koontz had mentioned earlier, and he also was telling me he had done his homework again before you all joined our field day this evening, and he said that he had just revisited his ag water quality plan. So he gets an A for his homework tonight. But if you are in Kentucky and you have 10 acres or more involved in agriculture or forestry, you do need an ag water quality plan. And so part of that plan can be incorporating streamside management zones, especially if you have a harvest operation. And Dr. Muller's going to talk to us a little bit more about that shortly. So I don't want to get too deep in that, but just point out that this is a forestry best management practice. And in Kentucky, we incorporate that into our ag water quality plans. He also mentioned fencing streams and excluding livestock from streams to help decrease bacteria that gets into our water bodies. And so using a livestock best management practice, because a lot of our woodland owners have both livestock and they also have crops as well as forestry operations. So making sure that we're utilizing all the best management practices that we can to ultimately protect our stream banks. If you don't have an ag water quality plan or need to figure out if you do, I know Renee dropped the accurate link. I always use this link. It'll get you there too if you go to your website, your web browser, and type this in, but this will direct you to the tools you would need to develop your own water quality plan, but also you can go to your local conservation district office for assistance. And it's important because as the landowner, it is your responsibility to know what's in the plan. Dr. Koontz also mentioned a little bit about establishing buffer zones, and there's a few things that we want to remember when we're establishing our buffer zones. Thinking about the buffer width is important. Also our planting strategy. He also accurately pointed out that our maintenance strategy is exceptionally important. We can't just walk away from these areas. And then if we are in areas of high visibility, what's our desires for what it's going to look like, and then maybe what's our tolerance level for. I kind of don't mind a wild and woolly stream buffer, but sometimes if it's in high visibility areas, some folks don't like that. And so then, Dr. Koontz, you put those pollinators that bloom next to on the edge of the plantings, and nobody seems to notice the wild and woolly behind it. But a lot of these factors, are going to be decided based on the function that you're interested in, your time, and your resources. We saw this in the video, these 3 zones of planting buffers. But also remember that the width of your buffer is really going to determine the benefit that you get from the buffer. So we want to have a minimum of 15 to 20 feet to have stream bank protection. There are other minimums that you need to check on if you're using that streamside management zone or SMZ during a timber harvest. But the wider the buffer, the greater the benefit. And I just like this visual that gives us an idea that the wider buffers that we can put in will start to pick up these ecosystem services or the benefits the wider we expand our buffer. So we get stream bank stabilization with those more narrow buffers and maybe a little water temperature moderation. But then as we expand the size of the buffer, we start to get nutrient removal, we start to get sediment control, and we get some flood control as well as wildlife habitat. And those are all important factors for us to implement so that we can protect our water quality and provide these systems, these services in our landscapes. So he also mentioned his planting strategy, and there are passive strategies where we naturally allow the plants to establish, and those will come up from the seed bank. And then also the other type is an active planting strategy. So that's deliberately picking out specific trees, shrubs, grasses that we want to have in the buffer. So in a passive strategy, a lot of times we can just stop mowing. It's sometimes as simple as that. It's pretty easy and low, I say lower maintenance at first, because really over the long term, I think a passive strategy might be more labor intensive for maintenance. It's inexpensive, so we're going to utilize the existing seed bank and seeds that are dispersed by wind and water. The caution here is just like what Dr. Koontz experienced are these non-native invasive plants that can take over. We see this a lot, and you can see it too in whatever area you live in. If you drive around and you see naturalized areas, invasive pressure is a real situation. And so even in really well-managed natural areas, invasive species are a real management challenge. So this is an example of a buffer that was just created passively. So we quit mowing it. This is 1 year after not mowing, but I will tell you that 10 years after not mowing and very little maintenance, it was full of honeysuckle. So just word to the wise on that. An active planting strategy means you create a planting plan, you remove undesirable plants. You might need to stabilize the stream bank or install some erosion control materials. You will then select your desirable plants, the species that you want, and install those. And then you need to maintain those plant communities. This can be more expensive upfront than passive, so keep that in mind too. And it can be time and labor intensive. So these are examples of ways that you might plant. You might plant by hand with a dibble bar. You might also use a mechanical planter for a larger scale planting. And Dr. Koontz also mentioned the deer browsing. He has hungry deer in his area. I think we all have hungry deer in our area. So having tree tubes for protection so that those tubes are protecting from deer browse, but be warned that you do have to install them properly, or you may have small mammals that get in and just chew off those seedlings right at the soil surface. So lots of critters out there that want to eat our seedlings as their tasty treat. I did want to take a minute to point out that we have cost share programs available for establishing riparian buffer zones on our streams. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program through NRCS has several efforts that are available this year for buffer establishment and also maintenance. So brush management would be one that you could utilize to help maintain stream buffers and deal with invasive species. And also our Kentucky Soil Erosion and Water Quality Cost Share Program. So in Kentucky, we typically just call that state cost share. For the 2022 year, we have 2 high priority practices that are related, riparian forest buffer and riparian herbaceous cover. So those are ones that will help you rank higher in the application process. And for both of these programs, I recommend going to your local conservation district office and asking for information. So with that, we have a bit of time that we will answer some questions that maybe have come in, and or Dr. Koontz, if you have more comments that you would like to make related to maintenance and the establishment, I guess, of your buffers.
I can give you a little update since the video was made. We and I hate to use it, but we did have to use a herbicide, glyphosate, Roundup. And I was out there last week, and it really had a marked effect on the honeysuckle. And we just have some spot areas to hit. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to do it on all of the riparian buffers that you saw in the aerial view of the farm, but I'm encouraged that we're beginning to get a handle on it. What I would strongly recommend is a regular inspection of your buffer and note what is beginning to invade, and something will invade. This can be everything from garlic mustard to bush honey or vine honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, tree of heaven, which we have a fair amount of.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I saw in our chat, someone asked the question of any recommendations for combating deer browse in large tree establishments. And Logan, thank you for chiming in. I see that Logan Nutt answered and said that his approach has been to plant more trees and just strengthen numbers, I guess, that you just expect a level of mortality from browse. And oftentimes that's true too. We know that when we plant in mass, we're not going to get 100% survival. And so that's why we plant lots of small seedlings and hope for a better outcome. And so if you can use those, the tree tubes, I think there's been some success with those as well.
Dr. Gumbert, we've tried in a few areas to put wire cages made from wire fencing. This is labor intensive, and we've only done it in a few selected areas, primary to protect milkweed. The sprays we've tried and they don't work. You know, the rains come along. I hate to say this, but they come along and are washed off.
So we have a question for you, specifically for you. What are some of your favorite trees or shrubs in the buffer, or which ones have been the most successful?
I think the ones that have been most successful are the ones that grow on lower levels: sycamore, poplar, maple. Well, and we've had a few ash, which are now gone. And then the burr farming ones, I'm blocking on it right now. I'll come back to it.
I've seen your sweet gums have been pretty successful.
Sweet gum, thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Another question is, how often should the ag water quality plan be updated? That's a good question. Depending on what's going on in your operation, most of the time we recommend every 2 to 3 years to update your ag water quality plan. If you're applying for state cost share this year, know that you will need to create a new plan. There's a new system for creating plans on your own through the state of Kentucky. And if you are applying for the state cost share program this year, they will want you to develop a new plan in that system that helps them link it to your application within their accounting system.
I'd like to say something about the ag water quality plan. I filed one years ago and I thought I was done. That was it. And then I was encouraged, I guess a couple of weeks ago, by Dr. Gumbert, and I said, oh my, more paperwork, more paperwork. I went to the website and it's easy. It opens up nicely. And I began to go through the practices, and some of the practices I didn't understand. And when you click on them, it explains them beautifully and gives illustrations. And so for each category, they ask usually, do you do one or all of these practices? And they ask you to click on one that you're doing. And then you don't have to do all 4, but they can be in the status of completed or you plan on doing them. And it's a very simple process. And most importantly, for all of us, it's an educational process. And it really gets you to thinking about what's happening to my land and what's happening to the water that runs off of it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that, because I do know that a lot of folks, when I ask them to update their ag water quality plan, or if they have done one, I get a fair amount of eye rolling and grumbling of, oh my gosh, more paperwork, more plans, more this, more that. So I appreciate you saying that. You know, in developing our ag water quality plans, our forest stewardship plans, our conservation plans for our farms, all of those, the processes for all of those really will be a learning experience, I think, for us, and help us to kind of dig in, you know, a little deeper into some of those practices. And that's how we learn, and that's how we become better managers of the landscape. Dr. Koontz, there's a question for you. Have you had any problems with beavers taking down your trees?
Yes, yes. We have a pond, and when a beaver hears running water, ingrained mentality is to stop that running water. And we just this year, we had a real problem with it. It raised the pond level up to within a couple inches of the top of the dam. And so we had to deal with this. In our particular area at the headwaters of Crooked Creek is the Boy Scout Dam. And they've been a very attractive, the lake has been very attracted to beavers. But then I guess their population increases and then they migrate. And it would be okay if they went up the hollows and built those, but it's where they hear running water, and that's what our pond had.
We have some extension agents in our system that do some trapping. So I assume you could, within the confines of the season, you can trap for beaver.
That's what we ultimately had to do.
All right, so I think what we'll do now is we will go ahead and transition over. Dr. Jacob Muller is with us, and he's going to share a little bit with us about how we're going to need to consider buffers when we have a timber harvest, and some of the connections with other benefits we'll see from utilizing buffers. If you haven't met Dr. Muller, he's reasonably new on our forestry and natural resources extension faculty, but his specialty is hardwood, silviculture, and forest operations. And Jacob, I will let you further introduce yourself if you have any other thing you want to tell our audience about yourself, and then it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Amanda. It's great to be here with you all this evening. I hope everyone is doing well. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here, and I'll do a little bit more of an introduction. So I am Jacob Muller. I am an assistant professor of silviculture extension here in the forestry department at UK. As Amanda said, I am relatively new. I've been here for just over 2 years, which also happens to be 2 years of a pandemic. So I haven't been able to get out as much and see the state as much as I would have liked to, but luckily things are changing and getting out, and hopefully we can have in-person field days really soon. So today I'm going to be talking about streamside harvesting, right? And the connections to water quality, nutrients, and why that's important for sediment and erosion control. So here in Kentucky, we have a Bmp Field Guide, and this was put together by Dr. Stringer, who is in my position before I was, along with a host of others, and this is tied to that the Ag Water program, and really it's laying this kind of foundation for helping us better manage our forests, and managing around streams is a really important part of that. So when we harvest or perform any forest operations near streams in particular, there's often risk for doing adverse things to the ecosystem and to the aquatic systems. There are potential for erosion, creating harvesting debris, not too dissimilar to what a beaver might do, and falling trees falling across, damming up streams, reducing habitat, as well as potential for leaking fluids and other things associated with working in the forest. And so there's lots of considerations that we make when managing, and particularly around forests. Our forests and our water are so important. The forest is this amazing buffer that helps cleanse the water that's so important to us. There are things that inherently happen when we harvest near in these riparian areas. But just generally speaking, oftentimes when we harvest, there's potential to increase the soil temperature, reduce soil moisture, decrease the quality of wildlife habitat, alter soil and in-stream nutrients, food availability, and lead to changes in the invertebrate communities. So there are these potentials for negative effects to take place from harvesting, but that's why we have streamside management zones and BMPs, best management practices. Right? So within the BMPs, there are SMZs. So a lot of acronyms in forestry and in agriculture, but streamside management zones. These are buffer strips between the timber harvest and the streams. And really the intention is to filter the water or filter the sediment out of the water as it moves from the forest into the streams, right? The SMZs can help maintain soil moisture, evapotranspiration, moderate the stream temperatures in the aquatic communities. So SMZs are really important when we do any sort of forestry activity, right? But it's important to recognize that not all streams are defined in the same ways. And so I thought it'd be helpful to quickly go through kind of the terms that we use in defining these different streams, because they have different requirements and different recommendations based on the characteristics of that stream. So perennial streams, those are those continuously flowing streams, except during periods of drought, right? Really dry periods when they may dry up, but for the most part, they're continuously flowing. Intermittent streams, these are seasonally flowing streams, as well as a response to precipitation, right? In large episodic precipitation events, likely see flooding coming down, very flashy kind of flash flooding type of events in these intermittent streams. And then the ephemeral streams, right? And these are purely based on precipitation, right? So otherwise would be dry. Following precipitation events, water fills up and those drain generally down into the intermittent or into the perennial streams. Okay. So best management practices. The guide that I showed you at the beginning, those are what is the minimum best management practices. Right? That's kind of the minimum that we set as a state in order to achieve those goals of reducing sediment and preserving habitat. Right? And so I'm going to talk about these things as kind of the minimum at which we can do, understanding that there's a lot more that we can do to help prevent sediment loss in particular. Right? But these minimums that are stated in this best management practices guideline defines or describes the perennial streams as having a 25 to 50 foot wide buffer depending on the slope, right? And so this overstory width is the width of the forest around that particular stream, right? So on slopes less than 15%, a 25-foot buffer. On slopes greater than 15%, a 50-foot buffer, right? And within these perennial streams, 50% of the overstory is to be retained, right? And we're talking about the total density of the forest and retaining 50% of that when we do any sort of harvesting activity, right? And then minimum distance to roads, logging trails, skid trails, and landings is a 50-foot minimum distance for under 15% and a 100-foot distance for 16% and over. The intermittent streams, there is no fixed width for the overstory. Okay, and so there's 0% overstory retained as required by these BMPs. We still have the minimum road distances from, or the minimum distances from the streams to the roads, trails, and landings. And similarly, those are 50 and 100 feet for those steeper slopes. And then the CWAH, cold water aquatic habitat, primarily trout streams, and those are designated, and you can look those up, those streams that are designated, and that's 100-foot buffer around those particular streams and 75% retention and 100-foot distance for roads. Okay. So I want to quickly talk about a project that I think really exemplifies the use of these BMPs and the stream management zones. And this was a project that was implemented out at Robinson Forest. So obviously it's quite a ways from Dr. Kuhn's farm, but nevertheless, the similar BMPs are applied throughout the state. And this was used to determine the effectiveness of these minimum requirements with these BMP best management practices. So the objectives were to evaluate the efficacy of the SMZs and looking at different widths. And so I'm going to describe a couple different treatments looking at BMPs, and these treatments tested the bare minimum, so Kentucky's BMP laws, and then gradually kind of increase the buffer and the overstory density to see if how much making those adjustments might reduce sediment entering into the streams. So just to quickly recap, or not recap, but to introduce this, KY BMP, so this is our bare minimums, and then BMP plus and BMP plus 2+ is kind of those enhanced treatments. Okay, so I won't go over all of the KY BMPs, but for the perennial streams, the BMP plus is the same, but increasing or doubling for the BMP2. For the overstory retention, instead of a 50% retention, it's 100% retention. So you can see that in those bottom little figures with the represented by the trees that were left in the forest from this harvesting activity. Similarly, with the intermittent streams, 25-foot buffer for the BMP plus, and then essentially doubling that for this most aggressive BMP treatment. And then 25% retention for the intermittent treatments. So in the Kentucky minimum BMPs, remember there was 0 overstory retention required. In these 2 test treatments, we increased that to 25%. And then we also added a femoral SMZ width for that, again, that BMP2+, that most aggressive one. And then at the end, you'll also see improved crossings, right? That refers to creating these, whether it's a bridge, a pipe grouping, or a culvert here to improve the water as it flows from higher up in the watershed through kind of the harvesting unit, really, and where the equipment needs to cross is where we're improving those stream crossings. Okay. Here's just some photos from the project, and so you can see it's a pretty intensive, large-scale, operational scale project that was performed out at Robinson Forest using these BMPs and testing each one of those particular treatments. They were monitored with weirs and high precision instrumentation to monitor the sediment, and how much of that was being released into the streams. Right. So what did we learn from this? And I think we can take a lot of this and apply it to our own woodlands and forests. Having some constructed stream crossing greatly improved the amount or reduced the amount of total suspended solids in the water. Right. And so this unimproved ford is essentially just the logging equipment moving across the stream, where we see a significantly more TSS, or total suspended solids in these waters. Where we look at the bridge and the culvert, and really there's no statistical difference between that and an unharvested control. So looking at the perennial SMZs and the impacts of these treatments, you can see that there was a significant difference between the Kentucky best management practices and these enhanced best management practices, the BMP plus and the BMP 2 plus, where there's really no difference between these BMP 2 plus treatments. Similarly, with the ephemeral streams, we're seeing a similar kind of structure for these for this figure, right? That's not to say that the Kentucky best management practices aren't reducing the amount of solids in the water, but these enhanced BMPs are actually doing an incredible job at achieving those goals. Similarly with stream temperature, where we see that the Kentucky best management practices here having the highest stream temperatures, and that's not expected, right? We know that the canopy creates microclimates, and having a dense overstory forest really moderates and buffers the climate in creating and reducing temperatures, right? So the conclusions, well, the crossings did a really good job, right? So this just kind of goes to show you how important taking the time and investing in stream crossings is when looking at reducing sediment entering into the streams. Relative to the Kentucky best management practices, the BMP plus treatment, the concentrations of the suspended solids declined by 81% at the ephemeral monitoring points and almost 50% at the perennial. The BMP2 treatments declined by 88% and the ephemeral by 86%, right? So pretty big differences when we're talking about changing the buffer 50 feet and increasing the amount of retention in the overstory. And so that just kind of shows the power of these buffers, right? When we're talking about best management practices in these stream management zones, in order to ensure that we have these healthy aquatic systems that support kind of this holistic approach to managing for the ecosystem, right? So long story short, BMPs work, right? They work because they're doing the trees in the forest are doing just what they're supposed to do, right? They are creating buffers and they're filtering and they're protecting these aquatic systems. And so whenever you're doing any sort of logging activity in your own woodland, anytime there's a contracted logging job, it's required that you follow at least the minimum BMPs and have a master logger on hand on each site to make sure that the job site is meeting these minimum requirements. Okay, and that's all I have for this, but I want to draw your attention to the publication that we have here in the department, and I added a link there, but this is Kentucky Logging Bmp Field Guide. So I just touched on a very small part of that, right? This field guide is 130 plus pages that describe kind of all the requirements. So the laws that you need to follow when implementing any sort of timber harvesting in your own woodland. And it's not just the law is in place to help preserve these ecosystems. But it's really there because we value the water, we value the ecosystem, and we value these things. And just as Amanda was showing, there's these large watersheds, and it all starts way up with these ephemeral streams and the intermittent down into the perennial and then these larger waterways. And so with that, I'm gonna stop talking. Maybe I won't stop talking, but I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, Jacob, thanks so much for sharing that information. You know, the one thing when I was looking at your data charts from some of the results that I was thinking about was in terms of sediment and the benefits of our buffers keeping preventing the sediment from getting into our waterways. In Kentucky, our phosphorus is often tied to those soil particles. And so anytime we're losing sediment and soil off the landscape, not only are we creating water quality problems just in of itself of having sediment in the water, but also it oftentimes is carrying nutrients with it as well. So yeah, so I'm always interested to see thinking about, you know, how can we keep phosphorus on the landscape and not in our water bodies? So that was something that really stuck out to me. Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing that. That project in Robinson Forest is really great in terms of the information that there was a shift and an adjustment in some of the BMPs that are in the Ag Water Quality Plan as a result of that. And so that's one thing that we want folks to know about too, is the Ag Water Quality Authority is kind of the governing body of that state law. And so what the authority does is look to research to inform the BMPs and update those as we get more information. So that was a critical research project for that as well. So I just want to remind our participants to drop some questions in the chat if you have some. We do have a few that have come up. I want to just go back. I think we addressed the beaver question, but in case we didn't, and beaver browse, you know, another strategy for that. I know Dr. Koontz, you mentioned that you all have used kind of wire cages that you made from old fencing, and that those are labor intensive to create, but those you know, could be a recommendation to help with beaver control and again, relocating or eliminating some of those beaver from the area, moving them out. And so that is, just wanted to make sure that we did address that question. Someone else also had asked about suggestions for appropriate bushes and grasses for upper level barriers. So I think what you mean there, Donna, is the outer zone. So the zones farther away from the water body itself. So I put in the chat some of the shrub suggestions or smaller trees. It could be things like rough leaf dogwood, silky dogwood, spice bush. I don't mind redbud also. Those are you know, pretty prolific. And if you have, I will say that we have one redbud in our yard as a tree in the yard, and it is a prolific seed producer. So those tend to at least spread pretty well, and those are a nice addition to the buffer. For grasses, as you're transitioning away from the water body and getting to that outer edge, things like switchgrass are nice, big blue stem, little blue stem, deer tongue grass. And I also added in making sure that we're including flowering perennials into that outer edge. So where we're getting sunlight, because as Dr. Koontz mentioned, having pollinator habitat is important. And if you're doing some restoration, you're putting in these kind of species, you can mix in some of those flowering perennials as well. They make a very attractive, visually attractive edge of the buffer, and they're also attractive to pollinators. So Dr. Koontz, any other grasses that you all have in your, I know you've got a native grass planting in one of your low fields.
Yeah, we started out with, I think we planted over 100 acres with Indian grass, big blue stem, little blue stem. And we found out that this too requires maintenance. There's nothing without maintenance.
That's true.
And especially the tall, real tall grasses like Indian grass and big blue stem. So those need to be mowed periodically, otherwise they fall over. You get, and it really detracts from a wildlife habitat because they're so dense. So my personal preference is to plant some of the smaller grasses like switchgrass and maybe a little blue stem. And then there's some other smaller ones in there. And this allows sunlight to get to some of the forbs that you're trying to establish. Then we were very fortunate to have Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, because we were working under a grant to periodically burn the fields. And this is no small activity. It takes 3 or 4 ATVs and some with water tanks on it to control the burn. It has to be the right kind of day, minimum wind. The technique is to go around the edge of the field, lighting it rapidly, and then allowing the flame to go into the center. This also has a benefit that that tree sprouts and trees that are starting to seed in your open fields will be retarded. So I don't want to hold anybody back, but these are some of the issues that come up when you're doing these practices.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dr. Koontz, about the native grasses and pollinator fields. We do promote those as also as a strategy for establishing a buffer on streams. We may not always in all of our landscapes want to have trees along the stream. I mean, that's my preference as a water person. I'm going to pick trees and then do that kind of staggered zone of plants. But if you don't want to do that and you just want to go with the pollinator fields and the native grass fields, there is certainly some art as well as science involved in getting those established. Just like what we were talking about with establishing the tree buffers, you have to consider what's in the native seed bank and also what's growing there currently. So if you just have, for instance, you have mowed fescue or mowed, most of the time, a lot of times we'll convert from a fescue field or a hay field, an old hay field. You're going to, if you don't use an herbicide, well, you almost have to use an herbicide pre-treatment. I'm not a big fan of using herbicide either, I have to admit. But when you're trying to convert into a different species stand, you often have to bring that in. And so you mentioned mowing is also important. And if you do want to maintain just the grassy area or the native grasses, warm season grasses area without having trees come in, because as we know, we're going to have trees in the seed bank and we're going to, those are, we're going to generate, that's part of succession, right? And especially in Kentucky, everywhere you've got some cedar, you've probably got cedar out there too. They're going to come in as early successional trees. And so mowing strategy that is recommended is that we mow strips in a 3-year rotation. Sometimes you might have an area that you need to mow yearly. And then, like you said, utilizing fire as a management strategy is that's really ideal for the conditions that our native grasses evolve to really prefer. So I think it's great that you were part of that project and you were able to get the burn crew out to do a fire burn. So Jacob, there's a question possibly that you could address, or maybe this is a potential project for us to work together. Becca's asking if there's an ability to plot results of the BMP study with Division of Water standards and nutrient TMDLs. And then also her subsequent question, is BMP +2 meeting standards? I think what she means is where we, is there enough data that has been collected from that study at Robinson that we could look at the places, the streams where the BMP +2 and where all of them, could we look at that nutrient data and does it meet our state standards for nutrient TMDLs? Because, okay, thanks, Becca. I know currently our nutrient standards in Kentucky are narrative. They're not numeric criteria for standards of water quality. And so, but we could look at some TMDLs and see if those match up. Jacob, I don't know if that's something that you have looked at all or could shine any light on. We might have lost him for a second, I'm not sure. And then somebody else mentioned in the chat that our Kentucky apiarist, Tammy Potter, has a book highlighting trees and perennials that are great for pollinators. So thanks for sharing that. I haven't seen her book, but that's a good suggestion. So let's see. I wanted to make sure that we're hitting all the questions in the chat. Oh, there's one question about black walnut trees and if they are good for riparian buffer zones. As far as I know, they're fine. They tend to, at least on a piece of property that my husband and I manage, they tend to be pretty prolific along the stream bank, and we've just let them grow because they are doing their job to hold soil in place, and I'm pretty happy with them being there. We have gone in and done a little bit of management to cut some of the lower limbs off, but I don't know of any reason that they wouldn't be good for planting in your riparian zone. And if you're, it's just, you wouldn't think about harvesting them necessarily if they're right in your riparian buffer, your stream side buffer. So if you want to grow a tree that you're going to harvest for wood utilization, you want to remember that those need to probably be planted away from your stream bank. So question about native grasses that are a candidate for cattle and horse pasture, as well as riparian buffers, since there's often spread after planting. So specifically to horses, horses are fairly sensitive to some plants. I don't know that any of our native grasses are harmful to them, but some of our equine specialists here at the university are pretty specific about species that they recommend. I know of at least one landowner who I believe has grazed switchgrass and has grazed it might just be switchgrass and Indian grass are the two that they have grazed. And so there are possibilities for having grasses that can cross over and serve both purposes. And also a note in the chat as well that there is a Lexington Fayette Urban County government has printable plans for streamside pollinator gardens, and a link there as well. That's the Plant by Numbers program, and it is a really nice stepwise procedure for the novice who wants to establish streamside buffers and really doesn't know where to start, they used to have a little interactive game where you can kind of move pieces around and design your landscape the way you might like to do. But there's a web link there that's really designed. Oh, good, you still have the game. That's good to know. That is focused for urban landscapes a little bit more than our rural landscapes. So keep that in mind as well. So Dr. Koontz, some last thoughts from you. While you make your final comments, I'm going to drop links to the 2 videos that we watched tonight. They are on YouTube, and I will drop the links to those in the chat.
You all have, our visitors have just been exposed to a lot of just tremendous information, and I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of the wonderful resources that agriculture extension services have. I think one thing that has really crossed my mind is that we're facing climate change. And I know you spot storms and so on, tornadoes don't represent the total trend, but in my observations, I really think, especially from the farm, we're seeing more rain events and heavier rain events. And what we've heard tonight are one of the last defenses that we have from polluting runoff. And so it makes us really important for us to be aware of what's happening around us. And it makes all important to focus on these systems that can provide protection and conservation. Then the last comment I would make, what really got me interested in streams and water was my experience with the Salt River Watershed Watch. And they have a wonderful website, and we're constantly looking for citizen scientists to go out there on a couple weekends a year and to sample these streams and give feedback as how effective our protection and practices are. So don't hesitate to look up the Salt River Watershed Watch.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I want to encourage folks, even if you're not in the Salt River Basin, Kentucky Watershed Watch as the whole organization, there are opportunities to sample water all over the state. If you're not from Kentucky, I think we've got a few folks who are from out of state. Definitely check out your local, within your state, the watershed programs and opportunities to sample water, because thanks, Michaela. Michaela just dropped the link in the chat for the Kentucky Watershed Watch website. And doing something on a voluntary basis, sometimes it feels like, oh my gosh, I've got enough to do. I've got so much going on. But when you invest your time in your local community and you really get to know your local water body in this case, it's just a really powerful thing to do. You get to have extra eyes that are on the stream. Our Kentucky Division of Water is responsible for monitoring streams and reporting that back to Congress every 2 years. But there's a limit to what our state and federal agencies can do for monitoring. And so having volunteers out on the landscape is a really important piece of that puzzle, as well as connecting you to your local waterways and enhancing your desire for a stewardship of those waterways as well. So thanks for reminding us of that, Greg, and thanks for being a dedicated volunteer for many years. And I know our paths crossed, I think, first from that, as well as from the woodland owners Association. And so also want to make sure, I see that Steve Perry put a plug in for the Kentucky Woodland Owners Association, KWOA. And if you're a woodland owner in Kentucky, or if you're not a woodland owner in Kentucky, I don't think they would not let you in, but you talk about some really interesting meetings and conversations around trees and water. That organization really does bring those groups together. So we thank them as well for being part of that in Kentucky. One last thing I'm going to drop in the chat pod. We are approaching the end of our virtual field day. And so your feedback and impressions are really important to me and important to all of us here in Extension. We like to know what you thought about our programs. We want to hear back from you and hear things that you learned and suggestions that you might have as well. So I encourage you to click on that link, and it will take you to an evaluation that you can complete as we wrap up here after we finish. And also, I can email you all that link as well if you can't get to it in the chat, or if you don't see that come in. So I just request that you go on and give us some feedback. So any other comments from Dr. Muller? Do you have any last comments that you'd like to share with the group? Or others who are attendees that have questions, feel free to drop your question in the chat box. I thought I saw a hand up, but it went back down. So folks are quiet tonight. We must have stunned them with lots of good information, and they're all ready to just head out to the woods and start working in their stream buffers. So folks, with that, we're going to stay here a few more minutes, but I just again want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the work that you do on your individual properties, and the work that you do to conserve our natural resources, not just here in Kentucky, but also in our entire Mississippi basin. I want to remind us all of that map that we looked at the beginning of the session, where we see such a large area of land in all of Kentucky and our water draining to that one common location, and that being the Gulf of Mexico. So just remember that all of our collective efforts make a big difference in the whole. So I encourage you to do what you can to make a positive impact on your local waterways. So one last question for you, Dr. Koontz, that came in. And this is from Michaela, and she says, many landowners face pressures to sell or develop their land. What are some words that you would share with them as a response to that pressure?
I would say, take a look at our neighborhood. I live my farm is right next to Bernheim Forest. And then down Preston Street are huge developments of warehouses, and it is gobbling up farmland, is gobbling up forest land. And Kentucky is in a tough place because we have many landowners, and it's hard to hold on to that land. I mean, and the developer comes along, and the families, the resources are spread out through a number of the kids and cousins. But if at all possible, just think what your natural land provides. And if there's any way to hold on it and to enhance it, I would just recommend to do it. There's no magic number. I think hopefully we'll get some revenue from carbon sequestration by growing forests, and trapping carbon and reimbursing the landowner. But you as a forest landowner really provide a tremendous resource to the community by providing clean water. And it's hard to put all of that in the bank, especially the way our society is structured. But this needs to be recognized and support legislation to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Koontz. I appreciate your thoughts on that. It's a tough balance, because as our society does move farther away from the farm and farther away from our rural communities, it's easy to get disconnected. And also, like you said, there's lots of demands on our energy, our time, our resources, our financial resources. And so I agree with you that that anything we can do to help compensate for the ecosystem services that landowners and farmers provide, I certainly hope that we can move to that in the future, because if it's hard to put a dollar value on that. I ask our ag economists all the time, just, can you give us a dollar value of what we're doing? And, it's so complicated. There's so many pieces of that puzzle. So anyway, thank you for those comments, Dr. Koontz, and thank you all for attending. We will wrap up and close our virtual field day. We thank you for attending with us and for playing along on another virtual excursion. I'd certainly encourage you to get out and do what you can, especially as the spring is springing and we have opportunity to do plantings and protect our stream buffers. So thank you all for being here, and hope you have a good evening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Koontz.